Yeah, I'll react to that, sure. Hey guys, let's learn. Original link to the video top of the description. My name's Connor if you're new. Hey guys. Nice to meet you, sir. Or madam. Though I can't hear your answer. Preemptive Flight, Kings and Generals, great channel. This came out just 6 days ago. Battle of Coronel, 1914, World War I. British Navy underestimated the Germans. Cool, let's go. Let's learn. Dun, dun.
At the outbreak of World War I, Germany's distant possessions in the Asia-Pacific were under threat from the Entente powers of Britain, Australia, New Zealand and Japan. The only significant force in the Asia-Pacific...
Japan? Oh, this is World War I. Sorry.
Australia...
I was like, wait, what? Japan?
Possessions in the Asia-Pacific were under threat from the Entente powers of Britain, Australia, New Zealand and Japan. The only significant force in the Asia-Pacific was the East Asia Squadron of Vice Admiral Maximilian Reichsgraf von Spee, who found himself isolated and surrounded by the enemy. His only choice was to try and escape to Germany through the Atlantic, while raiding the Entente along the way. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, Rear Admiral Sir Christopher Craddock's 4th Cruiser Division was hunting German shipping outside New York when he received new orders to head south and hunt down von Spee before he broke out of the Pacific. It was to be a grand game of cat and mouse. However, in a twist of fate, one miscommunication would lead to a disaster outside the port of Coronel. Every week, we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons. The Pacific War, the Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution, and Civil War.
War of Spanish Succession would be a good one to learn about again for me.
North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more. It has been long overdue, but we have finally created a YouTube channel exclusively for our Kings and Generals podcasts. Please go and check out Kings and Generals podcast, home to the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast. Link in the description and pinned comment. To see those, as well as get access to our exclusive Discord, see our schedule, and get early access to all videos, join the ranks of our patrons and YouTube members via the links in the description and pinned comment. Thanks to our supporters for allowing us to continue doing our dream job. During the outbreak of World War I in August of 1914, Vice Admiral Maximilian Reichsgraf von Spee of the Imperial German Navy's East Asia Squadron found himself outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by the British Royal Navy and her allies in the Asia-Pacific. Knowing that open confrontation against the British would likely result in his ship's destruction, Spee gathered his East Asia Squadron at Pagan Island, where he decided to sail for neutral...
Hey, that's sort of Mariana Trenches right there, right? Like right here-ish? Here?
Spee gathered his East Asia Squadron at Pagan Island, where he decided to sail for neutral ports in Latin America before escaping around Cape Horn into the Atlantic, from where they could ultimately return to Germany, raiding viable British and French targets along the way. On August 13th, the Emden was detached to independently raid in the Indian Ocean, as Spee set the rest of his squadron on a course for Eniwetok Atoll. While heading east, Spee bombarded the French Polynesian port of Papeete, where his location was reported to the British Admiralty by a French steamer. Meanwhile, on July 27th, the Royal Navy's 4th Cruiser Squadron of Rear Admiral Sir Christopher Craddock was patrolling New York Harbor to see if the Germans were trying to convert their ocean liners in the American port into armed merchant cruisers. After the Papeete, the ocean Christopher Craddock was patrolling New York Harbor to see if the Germans were trying to convert their ocean liners in the American port into armed merchant cruisers.
So this is 1914, very early World War I. So the U.S. isn't going to be in the war for another almost 3 years, right? Maybe 3 years. We got in 1917, I think. And so at this point, did we just allow for free usage of ports by both sides of the war? And so now the British are kind of patrolling New York Harbor to see if, to like report back to see if Germans are creating...
The Germans...
That's interesting.
...were trying to convert their ocean liners in the American port into armed merchant cruisers. After the Papiti bombardment report, the Admiralty ordered Craddock to take up a patrol around Cape Horn with the intent of stopping Spee. To aid Craddock, the Admiralty informed him that they were dispatching the modern armoured cruiser Defence and pre-dreadnought battleship the Canopus. However, upon discovering that the Emden was raiding in the Indian Ocean, the Admiralty cancelled these reinforcements.
The Panama Canal was already made, right? Wasn't that made under Teddy Roosevelt? 1904. Yeah, construction started. Right. So there was the Panama Canal. Was it just not allowed to be used for any warring parties?
Believing that the bulk of Spee's squadron was heading for the Indian Ocean.
Well, it belonged to the United States at the time, so...
However, upon discovering that the Emden was raiding in the Indian Ocean, the Admiralty cancelled these reinforcements. Believing that the bulk of Spee's squadron was heading for the Indian Ocean, the British Admiralty ordered Craddock to patrol the southwestern coast of Latin America, informing him not to worry about a significant German presence in the region. However, they failed to inform him that the defence was no longer coming. Then, in late October, the Admiralty found out Spee had reached Chile and informed Craddock that he was to hunt him down. Craddock's squadron was outnumbered, outgunned, outdated, and crewed largely by inexperienced reservists. While the Monmouth and Good Hope had a large number of 6-inch guns, only the Good Hope held two 9.2-inch guns mounted in single turrets. To make matters worse, the British 6-inch guns were in casemates on the side of the ships, meaning the
9 and 9.2-inch guns. So that's the diameter of the gun. So like a shell that wide, something like that.
Lower guns could only be used in calm waters. On the German side, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were equipped with 8 8.2-inch guns and 6 6-inch guns, while the light cruisers were girded with 10 4-inch guns each. Von Spee's officers were experienced and distinguished, and the crews of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had earned accolades for gunnery before the war.
Well, you could use the lower guns in non-calm waters, right? If you timed it right when you sway upward, but then it's going to be insanely inaccurate.
Craddock's squadrons of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had earned accolades for gunnery before the war. Craddock's squadron had an overall speed of 23 knots against Spee's 25 knots. Additionally, Craddock's depended on the superior firepower of the Canopus, but the warship could only pull 16.5 knots, hindering his overall speed. Craddock had been given ambiguous orders to be prepared to meet the enemy in the company. When the Canopus arrived in the Falklands on October 22nd, she required a serious overhaul, unable to pull any more than 12 knots. Thus, Craddock had a major problem. Without the Canopus, his squadron stood no chance, but with her, they were too slow to force an engagement with Spee. Craddock sent word to the Admiralty explaining his situation and asked permission to split his squadron into 2 groups to operate on the east and west coasts of Latin America to hunt Spee. The Admiralty agreed and established the East Coast Squadron under Rear Admiral Archibald Stoddart, which consisted of 3 cruisers and 2 armed merchantmen. On the 22nd, Craddock sent another signal to the Admiralty, stating he would depart the Falklands to hunt for Spee without the Canopus, as the incoming defence should make up for her. This signal was only received on the 27th, when a fateful miscommunication took place. It was clear that Craddock was trying to voice his concerns, while indicating he was still abiding by his standing orders, which he believed was to hunt down Spee regardless of his circumstances. During this time, the first Sea Lord of the Royal Navy, Prince Louis of Battenberg, was being replaced by one Admiral Jackie Fisher due to the former's German descent. Fisher and Winston Churchill had been too preoccupied fighting for the first Sea Lord position to address Craddock's dilemma. Alongside the communication delays, they were too distracted to
I wonder German descent how far back, because if it was like 4 generations back, that's a little extreme maybe, but it's wartime.
realize Craddock's dilemma. Alongside the communication delays, they would.
I mean, in World War II, we put Japanese Americans in camps regardless of how long they've been in there, so
to disposition to address Craddock's
it's a bit more extreme compared to just pulling out a commander's
dilemma.
That wasn't a great comparison, sorry.
Admiral Jackie Fisher due to the former's German descent. Fisher and Winston Churchill had been too preoccupied fighting for the First Sea Lord position to address Craddock's dilemma. Alongside the communication delays, they were too distracted to realize Craddock was making a fateful mistake. Craddock's last signal reaffirmed his belief that the defense would soon arrive, and that his standing orders were to force an engagement with Spee. In reality, the Admiralty expected Craddock to exercise caution, only engaging German forces if they were vulnerable, and to try to lure Spee to the Canopus for an engagement if possible. Churchill sent a reply instructing Craddock that the defense was to remain on the east coast, and that he had sufficient forces for the task at hand, not commenting on his intention to abandon the Canopus. It seems Churchill misunderstood Craddock, who presumably received the signal on November 1st, and most likely understood it to mean he was doing as was expected of him. Another reason for the impending disaster to come was the recent fate of Rear Admiral Ernest Trowbridge, who was awaiting
Communication, I bring this up all the time. Communication technology has got to be one of the greatest improvements in how mistakes can be avoided, especially in warfare or in any scenario.
Failing to engage the enemy.
And I know they had, much better communications than in the 1800s, but still.
Trowbridge, reason for the impending disaster.
It seems takes a bit more time and is not as clear or accurate clear to read.
Was the recent fate of Rear Admiral Ernest Trowbridge, who was awaiting a court-martial for failing to engage the enemy. Trowbridge was a friend of Craddock's, and Craddock did not intend to be court-martialed for shying away from a fight like Trowbridge had. On the 3rd of November, Fisher received a signal from Valparaiso that Spee had been sighted and urgently sent word for the defense to join Craddock, stressing the need for him to concentrate his forces with the Canopus, but by then it was far too late. Back on October 27th.
This is the roughest waters in the world, right? The Drake Passage. And so having to cross this so much, I'm assuming, is not ideal.
Canopus sent word for the defense to join Craddock, stressing the need for him to concentrate his forces with the Canopus, but by then it was far too late. Back on October 27th, Craddock had dispatched the Glasgow to the Chilean port city of Coronel in the hope of receiving a signal from the Admiralty to relieve him of his fatal obligation to intercept Spee. On the 28th, Craddock ordered the Canopus and the colliers to make their way to the Juan Fernandez Islands, where he was taking his squadron to refuel, and for Otranto to patrol around Puerto Montt. When the Glasgow arrived at Coronel on the 31st, she received not a signal from the Admiralty, but a series of wireless messages between the German ships, indicating Spee was near. Captain John Luce of the Glasgow relayed this information to Craddock, who began sailing north to rendezvous with her. The Glasgow quickly departed Coronel, missing a signal sent by the Admiralty on November 1st, which instructed him not to risk an engagement without the Canopus.
Again.
Meanwhile, Spee received word that the Glasgow had been spotted departing Coronel, so he departed Valparaiso to hunt her down. On the 31st, Glasgow patrolled northwest of Santa Maria Island before she and Otranto had engagement without the Canopus. Meanwhile, Spee received word that the Glasgow had been spotted departing Coronel, so he departed Valparaiso to hunt her down. On the 31st, Glasgow patrolled northwest of Santa Maria Island before she and Otranto rejoined Craddock 50 miles west of Coronel at 1:05 p.m. on November 1st. At this point, further radio signals indicated the presence of the Leipzig. Thus, Craddock began hunting north for the Leipzig, while Spee was hunting south for the Glasgow. The British ships formed a line abreast formation, roughly 15 miles apart, with the Glasgow on the eastern end. The seas were rough, making it impossible to send a boat between the ships to deliver messages. At 4:17, the Germans spotted smoke from the British line, prompting Spee to order full speed so that the Scharnhorst, the Gneisenau and the Leipzig were approaching the enemy at 20 knots, while the Dresden and the Nürnberg lagged behind. At 4:20, the Glasgow and the Otranto gained a visual on the 3 German cruisers 12 miles north of them, and quickly reversed course. At this point, the Canopus was en route to aid, but was over 300 nautical miles away and would not make it in time. The chase went on for 90 minutes, as Craddock faced a dilemma. The German ships were faster than him and were closing in on his fleet due to the slower-moving Otranto. His options now were to either abandon the Otranto or to turn and fight with the Otranto. By 5:10 p.m., Craddock elected to fight. The sun was against his back, while blinding the German gunners, handing Craddock the advantage. However, sunset was due at 7 p.m., after which his force would be silhouetted by the sunset glow, and the Germans would be concealed by darkness and indistinguishable from the shoreline behind them, giving them a significant advantage. Thus, Craddock needed to...
Timing. I love these little minute but important details of fighting, like in general, but on sea especially, is that you have to take in so much more into account of weather and well, you have to do that for land too. Just the little things that I didn't think about, but are obviously smart moves. So having the sunset and the sun behind them is good for them before the sun sets, and after the sun sets, then the roles reverse, and now the Germans get the advantage.
Forced the battle before 7 p.m. Craddock drew his ships closer together while taking a southeastern course, intending to cut across the bows of the Germans. However, this proved impossible, given Otranto's top speed of 15 knots, so he reluctantly began sailing south in parallel to the Germans. Spee understood Craddock's intention and made sure to keep his force at a safe distance, roughly 13 miles away. Craddock attempted to close in at 6:18, steering directly at the Germans, but Spee simply pulled back 16 miles. This back and forth went on until 6:50, when the sun began to set, and Spee began closing the distance. By 7:05, the sun had finally sunk beneath the horizon, placing the German ships under a shroud of darkness and making them indistinguishable from the shoreline behind them, while the British ships were perfectly silhouetted by the sunset glow. At 12,000 yards, Spee ordered his ships to open fire. The Germans fired with a combined force of 16 8-inch guns against the 2 9.2-inch guns of the Good Hope. The Scharnhorst focused upon the Good Hope, while the Gneisenau trained her fire on the Monmouth. Simultaneously, the Dresden and the Leipzig fought an almost entirely separate battle with the Glasgow. The Scharnhorst's third salvo knocked out one of Good Hope's 9.2-inch guns within the first 5 minutes of combat. Half of the British 6-inch guns were constantly flooding in their lower casemates when their doors were opened due to the choppy seas, rendering them practically useless. To make matters worse, the British 6-inch guns had an effective range of 6,000 yards or less, allowing the Germans to dominate with their 8-inch guns, which could fire at a range of 10,000 yards. Because of this, Craddock was forced to draw even closer to the Germans, but this meant the German gunfire would become even more accurate. Meanwhile, the Otranto's 8 4.7-inch guns were proving to be completely useless.
So the heavier projectiles from the cannons actually go further? Is it because they're harder to stop from the air resistance, and also they just have more gunpowder behind them?
Realizing that his ship was a sitting duck, the captain of the Otranto immediately retired west at full speed. By 7:30, Craddock had finally come within 6,000 yards of his opponent, but the German gunfire had taken its toll. Both the Good Hope and the Monmouth had caught fire, presenting perfect targets, whereas the German ships seemingly had disappeared into the darkness. The Glasgow steered up between the Monmouth and the Good Hope, opening fire on the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau. Up until this point, the Glasgow had gone relatively unscathed by the Leipzig and Dresden's 4-inch guns, but now she came under bombardment by the 8-inch guns of the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau. The Glasgow took 5 hits, one of which punched a 6-foot hole beneath her waterline. Realizing that the Glasgow was hopelessly outmatched, Captain John Luce ceased firing and broke contact. By this point, Monmouth had taken a shell from Gneisenau that blew the roof off her forward turret, starting a large fire, resulting in an ammunition explosion, nearly blowing her turret off the ship. By 7:35, ablaze and severely damaged, she had begun to veer slowly out of line. Meanwhile, Craddock's flagship, the Good Hope, had taken a shell to her forecastle, setting it ablaze. At 7:35, from a distance of 5,500 yards, Craddock suddenly charged the German ships. This prompted Spee to order his forces to concentrate fire upon her. After taking a total of 35 hits, at 7:50, the Good Hope's forward magazine exploded, severing the bow from the rest of the ship. She sank quickly, taking with her all 926 officers and men, including Craddock. Craddock.
Jesus.
4 of the midshipmen aboard the ship were the first casualties of the newly formed Royal Canadian Navy. Scharnhorst then joined Gneisenau to fire upon Monmouth, whose crew had just managed to put out her fires. By this point, Monmouth was heavily listing to port, and all of her guns were disabled. After breaking contact around 8:05, the Glasgow came across the Monmouth at 8:15 to see her trying to put her stern to the heavy northerly swell to mitigate the water she was taking on at the bow. There was nothing the Glasgow could do to assist the Monmouth as the moonlight began to illuminate both ships.
So 2 big things I'm learning that are super important in battleships and, warring ships on the sea are the range of your guns and how fast your ship can go. Because how fast your ship can go, I mean, given the already negative consequence of having when the sun goes down to sunset and the German boats being almost invisible against the shoreline, and now the British boats highlighted against the horizon and the sunlight, is you couldn't outmaneuver that. And so with the Germans having faster ships and longer range guns, it just seems like they were just kept following you, and I don't know how the British could have seen this as any sort of victory, if they knew that the German ships were faster and with longer range guns, because I feel like knowing that and knowing that you're about to be highlighted while they are going to be almost invisible, maybe you could try and outmaneuver them and change the way and have you towards the shoreline if you had faster boats. It just seemed like kind of a loss from the beginning.
She broke
because
contact
of those
again at
factors.
8:50, sailing into the darkness. Meanwhile, Spee had maneuvered his squadron around the British formation to try and pin them against the moonlight. The Monmouth was trying to limp north when the Nürnberg, which had been trailing behind the German squadron, spotted her at 8:35. Venturing closer, she noticed that the Monmouth was listing 10 degrees to port. The Nürnberg illuminated her with her spotlight in the hopes she would toss up her colours and surrender, but there was no response. Consequently, the Nürnberg began firing warning shots at 9:20, aiming high, yet still no response came. The Nürnberg turned off her searchlight, and suddenly the Monmouth increased her speed, turning towards Nürnberg. Nürnberg immediately began firing upon her at point-blank range. At 9:58, Monmouth capsized and sank, taking her entire crew of 734 men with
Jesus Christ, loss of life in naval battles. What was I going to say? For a second, I thought they were going to pull a genius move there with, taking advantage of the spotlight off and then going in. And for a second, I thought they might be able to hit the Nürnberg.
With her. At around 9:20, the Glasgow's crew had spotted the Nürnberg's searchlight upon Monmouth, and after seeing the gun flashes, knew the Monmouth had been finished off. With over 600 shells fired upon her, and after suffering 5 hits on her waterline, the Glasgow fled west, followed by the Otranto. The Glasgow's casualties amounted to 5 lightly wounded men, and tragically the death of some parrots that the crew had purchased. At 10:15, Spee gave up.
60 of the exotic birds were released from their cages with a chance to make it to safety in the Chilean mainland. They rose in a cloud of brilliant blues and greens and oranges, but the birds settled back on the Glasgow's upper works. As the first salvos thundered, the birds crashed into the crew, sat on the gum barrels as they fired, or were swept aboard. Only 10 survived.
Tragically, the death of some parrots that the crew had purchased. At 10:15, Spee gave up the hunt for the Glasgow and Otranto and turned north to make his escape.
Did they get any hits?
With no survivors from either Monmouth or Good Hope, the British had suffered 1,660 deaths, including Admiral Craddock. On the German side, the Scharnhorst had suffered 2 hits. A 6-inch shell had struck above her armor belt and penetrated a storeroom, but this had miraculously not caused an explosion. The Gneisenau had received 4 hits, one of which nearly flooded her officer's wardroom. neither warship suffered any
Wow.
deaths, with only 3 men wounded on the Gneisenau.
Wow.
The Battle of Coronel marked Britain's first naval defeat since the Battle of Lake Champlain during the War of 1812. Word of the battle caused a sensation in Germany and dismay in Britain. However, Spee had used half of his ammunition during the battle, which was something that could not be replenished. He had not broken out into the Atlantic yet.
I'm sure that that is worth the morale boost of defeating the greatest navy in the world in an open sea battle.
And the British would seek vengeance. Thus, perhaps his victory would be Pyrrhic. More videos on that could not be replenished. He had not broken out into the Atlantic yet, and the British would seek vengeance. Thus, perhaps his victory would be Pyrrhic.
Maybe in lives it could be Pyrrhic, but in effect, I don't think that any whatever is done to these guys in the future, the Germans, can remove that sort of psychological boost of defeating, again, the greatest
More
navy.
videos on naval warfare during the First World War are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more.
I'm not sure how much the British ship captains knew of the capability of, the longer firing guns of the Germans and the faster speed boats of the Germans. But if they did, was that not a little foolish to start that engagement at all? If you knew that, it seemed like it was doomed from the start, and the casualty and ship loss differences, I think, speak to that. So it's one of the things about being on a ship that I'd imagine, I've never been in war, never held a gun in my life, but that it's like, I feel like if you're in the Navy in war battles, you're either going to have very few casualties or 0 casualties or all casualties, Whereas I feel like on land, it's more, every given invasion or fight, you're probably going to have some casualties, but less often I'm sure that the entire battalion or platoon or whatnot will die completely. But with ships, it's like if your ship goes down and you can't get off, and even if you do get off, you have to have your party finish victoriously for you to be scooped up. It's just not scary. Would appreciate any comments down below, guys. Disagree with anything I say or answering any of my questions, any comments at all. You guys are always great with that, and hopefully I'll see you next time, next video. We'll keep on learning together. Bye, guys.